Greetings and salutations. A little bit of evening drawing here. And I'm picking my own hair off the drawing table. It's time for a haircut. Not that that is something you want to hear. So, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm generally not a talker. I've never been much for gabbing. There are people who can make talking a career. I'm just never have been one to talk too terribly much. But, if I'm going to utilize this medium, I should endeavor to change my ways. So, there is one thing that I find kind of interesting, is among the artistically minded, there seems to be, at least that I remember, an inherent antagonism toward industry. And while it might seem like a reasonable assertion to be anti-industrial, let's see, how do I put this? It's not historically accurate because without industry, there wouldn't be the advantages that most artistically minded people would have today. For instance, the simple concept of artistic paints. Back during the Renaissance, everything was handcrafted. And while that seems like a good idea, I've thought about that myself, going and getting some dried pigment and getting some refined linseed oil and mushing up my own oil paint. And you consider the amount of time it takes to do that sort of thing. Would you rather your time spent doing that or doing artwork? It's like, I'd experimented with the idea of formulating my own India ink. And you look it up, all the Googling, that all explains that it's carbon black in distilled water. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. You look up videos on Sumi Japanese India ink, and it's a lot more complicated. Yeah, you can make some bare bones basic black ink, but is it going to handle the way you want it? Is it going to have the flow that you want? And then in regard to artist oil paints, the pigments had to be selected, had to be found, had to be mined. An awful lot of it was mineral deposits, because what we take for granted as synthetic compounds, today they were organic compounds, and they usually weren't very permanent. So they weren't usually widely used. Most artistic paints were mineral-based or chemical reaction-based. And that required skill and craft. But the biggest thing is it required time. If Michelangelo had to go and grind his own paint and mull it into the proper consistency before he made his fresco, the Sistine Chapel, how much less time would he have had to work on the Sistine Chapel? So there has to be some level of gratitude toward industry. Because if I've done my reading correctly, industrialized artist materials didn't show up until well after the Renaissance. And this is manufactured pigments, manufactured ink, manufactured paints. And it wouldn't be until the Industrial Revolution where things like tube oil paint was available. Maybe not readily available, but was available. You didn't have to go find a ruby and grind it down into powder to the right consistency and then mull that into some kind of oil paint. You look up an older copy of the Artist's Handbook and you look at some of the processes involved in making some of these pigments. And you'd spend a good chunk of your time doing nothing but making art supplies, not making artwork. And the other thing, too, to take into account is the consistency of the artwork. That's the other thing, too. So, for instance, one of my favorite drawing brushes, this is the Princeton Velvet Touch 10-0 fine liner, whatever. And even then, since it's a manufactured piece, not every single one of them reacts exactly the same. Some are good for thicker lines, like this one has a slightly thicker line than what I'm used to. Pardon my head bumping into the tripod. And some produce really fine lines. It's something similar to the steel nibs that I use. Some work great, but for a short period of time. Some don't work so great. Some work for heavy lines. Some I can manage to use with really super fine lines, and that only lasts for such a long time because paper is a relatively abrasive surface, and you get a little fine, itty-bitty little sliver of steel that does exactly what you want it to do. Well, eventually it wears out. And it's just the irregularities in something that's manufactured. But the steel nib for drawing, well, that's a relatively modern thing. Like the ballpoint pen. We all take the ballpoint pen for granted. But the ballpoint pen, I think, isn't even 100 years old as an invention. Electric cars and the internal combustion engine have been around far, far longer than the ballpoint pen. So, some gratitude toward the industrial arts. Some level of gratitude. And it's possible that this is just an example of an age that where a population has had so much so good for so long that we take advantage and take for granted things that could vanish tomorrow. Not that I'm saying people have it easy, but say you want to paint a canvas. Well, you would have to find someone who made the canvas, and then you would have to take the time to find the right wood to make the stretcher bars. Wood that didn't buckle, bend, or twist under a load over a period of time. And then you would have to find the right tools to stretch the canvas in such a way that when it finally was set, it didn't cause the frame to buckle. And then you would have to find the right animal skin glue for the sizing that didn't mold or rot. And then you'd have to have the right ground to do your oil painting on. And how much time was spent doing that? That you could be otherwise painting. Or if you did ink work, you'd have to find the right feather, quill, that produced the line work that you wanted. Which is why an awful lot of art during the period of time, in the way back days, the Renaissance and the pre-Renaissance, an awful lot of that was charcoal and silver point. Because even graphite, that was a thing. That's a modern invention. So, anyway, that's all I have for that.